MA Fashion Media and Communication with International Magic present Hyper Bodies, a summit on the
role of bodies in a more than human world. Chiara Di
Leone. My body is not the same as yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for inviting me here today. The sound thing, it's a bit strange, so I'll try. If I'm shouting too much, just tell me.
The shout
I like to shout, so we can go. Anyway, so I will start by saying that I am normally fashion is not my trade. I am a writer. I'm not a visual artist, and I am trying, but I am very much interested in the question of the future, and especially how is that we get to know things about the future. And this is a question that's preoccupied me a lot, especially when it comes to global models and planetary models. So the talk that I want to give today, it's sort of an attempt to bridge my own interest in research with what I can speculate and imagine and see that can relate to fashion. So in terms of techniques of making sense of the future. The title of this talk is My Body's Not the Same as Yours, and later we'll see what this means. But the word body here is intended to be interpreted as a body in terms of a text body. And I'm going to talk about two literary techniques that are also techniques of making sense of the future. And one is the report, the trend report, and the other one is the list, the in and out list that we're all sort of familiar with. And I'm going to take these two examples as things that sort of represent bigger tensions between the ways that different techniques of making sense of the future. So here's what I'm not going to talk about. This is a butterboard. And it's something that was, there were discussions whether this specific item was in or out for 2023. The Guardian wrote about it. I don't know, somehow this object was very present in my online life. And I'm talking about this because I am not going to talk about the things that are going to be in or out, or I'm not going to talk about the objects per se. I'm going to talk about the conditions of possibility that make us talk about an object like this. So how is it that we come to contemplate whether a butterboard is in or out? What are the discursive conditions that make it possible for us to predict whether something like this is going to be in the future or not? So, like I said, I want to talk about the report and the list as two genres. First, let's start with the report. This is a screenshot from, I believe, a memo from this cultural strategy company organization called Nemesis that comes from the now defunct, I believe, K-Hole consultancy. And they were a group of artists in New York that in the mid-2000s, 2010s, yeah, around between 2011 and 2014, they produced a series of reports that were PDFs. And so each of these PDFs sort of had a very specific argument for what the future would look like. So there would be something about a neologism like normcore, for example. And then there would be an entire set of evidence that would be like images or text or other things that would prove that everything really is about being normcore, or everything, the word is structured around this concept. Or maybe the fact that youth doesn't exist, just state of mind. And then, there would be like all these sexy images that would somehow prove that this is really what's going on in the future, this is really what's going to happen. And the authority that these groups of artists would take to kind of make these claims was not something that was, very scientific or sort of extremely well researched necessarily, but their authority was that they were artists, and as artists they had sort of a bigger sensibility towards what's going on in society, and they were much more attuned with what the future would bring. So it's, you know, the classic example of the role of artists in society as avant-garde. And this is not obviously a new idea. Very famous media theorist, maybe the most famous one, Marshall McLuhan, said that, or wrote that, this specific sentence that says, "I think of art at its most significant as a DEY line, a distant early warning system that can always be relied on to tell the old culture what is beginning to happen to it." So this is a picture of the distant early warning system, which was a system of radars and whatever, you know, technical instruments that were placed at the US border during the Cold War. And they would detect missiles or potential threats before any other system. And it's distant because you could detect things that were coming up from very far away. And it's early because you could detect it before anyone else. So this idea, going back to this idea of the report and artists' early distant warning, this is a very explicit sort of, again, authority of saying, okay, we are artists. As artists, we are more attuned to what's going on in the world. Therefore, we can craft this document and we can tell everyone what's going to happen. This is something that it's, of course, all well and good, and it's a very well-known genre, but there are other more subtle ways in which art, and especially writing, have been influencing the ways in which we make sense of the future. So on your right, yes, there is Herman Kahn, who is a war strategist from the 50s, who was working at RAND Corporation, was a research and development organization from the US military during the Cold War. And previous to Herman Kahn, to this man, the ways in which predictions about what was going to happen during the conflict were mostly made by asking individual people on the field, like generals, what they thought was going to happen. So it was all based on the knowledge and expertise of people on the field. But during the Cold War, because the threat was so far and so abstract, and it was so complex, like the nuclear bomb, you couldn't just go to a general and ask them what they thought about the nuclear bomb. You had to sort of model this in a much more complex way. And so what Herman Kahn did was to consult people in Hollywood who were writing propaganda films, like Leo Rosten was a well-known propagandist, and ask them how did they solve the conflict of conflicting narratives and things that in films could go any possible way, really. And he came up with this strategy of scenario planning. So instead of saying, oh, we are going to predict that XYZ is going to happen, he said that, well, we don't know what's going to happen. This is a cone of all of the possible things that could happen. And for each of these paths, we're going to write a story for how this could go. Just to kind of embrace the complexity and the difficulty of this specific historical moment. And the scenarios where they were born, they were sort of, the word scenario comes from Italian commedia dell'arte, which is a theatrical genre. And so they are not very specific, they're not very vague, they're normally a couple of paragraphs to just describe the situation, they describe a few characters, they describe the narrative arc of how things could go, but they don't really go into details, because in commedia dell'arte, actors have to actually improvise. What they just knew who their character was and pretty much the story, but then they had to kind of just go for it. And this is maybe one of the most famous reports in human history, and it's also the very first report about the world as one thing, as one object of knowledge, and it is The Limits to Growth, which was published in 1974, and it sort of gives several scenarios of how natural resources, demographics, pollution, and whatever variables they had in the 70s to make sense of the world as such, as one. And it's a projection of all these different variables for different pathways and different scenarios. So, you know, whether we're talking about the limits to growth or commedia dell'arte or scenarios during the Cold War, or this kind of report, it's what these things have in common, what all reports have in common, is the fact that they are pretty much centralized. There is a narrative or multiple narratives that are pushed from a group of people who are experts or are somehow positioned to know more than the rest. And they're articulated in a way that then they can be popularized, published in the form of a book or a PDF or a talk. So it's some kind of knowledge that comes from the center and then spreads towards the margin, like the peripheries. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about, in contrast to that, is this in and out list that we've seen emerging more and more. And it is very easy to kind of dismiss these artifacts as symptoms of our main character syndrome online, that we all think we are the main character. I don't even remember where this is from, but we know. I just wanted to show this as a different kind of literary medium. What I think it's relevant about this kind of things is that it comes from individuals. It's not meant to sort of influence like a big crowd, and it's something that makes sense in relationship to other people who share it online. And they are made in a paratactic way. So parataxis is a technique that's where there is no hierarchy. So for example, long nails and vaping and mental health all exist in the same list. And it's sort of this poetic, chaotic thing that doesn't really make sense on its own. And I wanted to show this list from Roland Barthes from 1975, J'aime, je n'aime pas, like, I don't like, where he also does something very similar. He says, I like salad, cinnamon, cheese, pimento, marzipan, the smell of new cut hay, roses, peonies, lavender, champagne, loosely held political convictions, too cold beer, flat pillows, Sartre, Brecht, walking in sandals on the lanes of southwest France, the mountains at 7 in the morning, leaving Salamanca, etc., etc. So these are all the things that he likes. And the things that he doesn't like are white Pomeranians. I don't even know what that means. But women in slacks, geraniums, strawberries, the harpsichord, Miro, tautologies, animated cartoons, Arthur Rubinstein, villas, the afternoon, Bartok, Vivaldi, telephoning, children's choruses, Chopin, fidelity, spontaneity, evenings with people I don't know, etc. This is a list just kind of similar to the ones we saw before, but what I like about it is that in the last paragraph, I'm just going to read it out loud because I really like it, says, I like, I don't like. This is of no importance to anyone. This apparently has no meaning. And yet all this means my body is not the same as yours. Hence, this is an anarchic form of tastes and distastes, a kind of listless blur. Gradually appears the figure of a bodily enigma, requiring complicity or irritation. Here begins the intimidation of the body, which obliges others to endure me liberally, to remain silent and polite, confronted by pleasure or rejections which they do not share. It's beautiful, but anyway, the point that I'm trying to make here, here's another list from Borges, which is also quite wonderful. And I'm not gonna go into it now. Is that these are like radically two different ways of relating to the world, and they are not necessarily in contrast. And we also had the kind of like, this is an attempt to synthesizes two views. So the Washington Post, which is a big institution, a big publisher, tried to kind of make the ultimate in and out list, and then it comes out with things that are plausible but very silly, like out anagrams and in human design, or out IUDs and in vasectomies. Okay. You know, it's embarrassing because this is not something that's meant to be done centrally. It's something that's meant to be shared by people, and it makes sense when there is this kind of local experiential knowledge that it's just there to say, you know, I am a different person. My body is not the same as yours. I live in this specific, like, ineffable pocket of reality that I only inhabit. And I'm going to make a wild claim now and say and talk about this text that's called The Use of Knowledge in Society by Friedrich Hayek, who is an economist, maybe the very first economist who invented the term and the school of neoliberalism, which has a very bad reputation. But in this specific text, Hayek argues for markets because he thinks that there is a certain quality to knowledge that cannot be captured by central planning or by, you know, big institutions and big authorities. There is a quality of knowledge that will always be local, and it will always be with individuals or within specific kind of, pockets of society, or even internal knowledge. And so what he says is that things like, I mean, I don't know what he would think of in and out lists specifically, but what I would argue is that efforts like this to make sense of things in a very personal way and to share them, they kind of constitute, they only make sense when they come together and they emerge as a sort of collective body of knowledge. And so, you know, going back to the very beginning to the report, we can see that these are, again, two very different ways of making sense of the future, and that maybe what I find personally more interesting is to kind of try and reconcile this smaller and weirder ways of producing knowledge by making a list that apparently doesn't make sense, but it might make sense when aggregated, rather than saying, oh, I have somewhat like a more better position to say what is in or what is out, or what the future holds. But ultimately, well, I hope I kind of gave you an idea of how different ways of making sense of the future through text and through discourse operate in the world. And yeah, that's kind of all I have. Thank you.